is why I'm going to take the meeting this afternoon. At a useful pre-meeting with colleagues this morning, I just reminded them that I haven't done this before. So please, if I'm getting it wrong, tell me. If I'm moving off the agenda, which I can do at times, alert me to that, and we'll find a way through. I won't do it as well as Karen does it, but we'll try our best, and I'm sure we'll get through in her absence. Is it important? I think it might be actually that we just go around and do introductions, because I'm aware also Rob Nixon is not able to join us this afternoon. Angela, do we have somebody in Rob's stead?
Yes, Mark. Rich will be picking up all the reports from the force, and we'll be covering those on the agenda today.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Sorry that Rob can't join us. I think it is just worth just very quickly going around the table and doing introductions. So I'm Mark Peel. I'll be chairing this afternoon's meeting. Can I go? I'll go around the screen in the direction I can see it. Gail, I'll hand to you next. You're on mute, Gail.
Sorry, schoolgirl error. Microphone muted. I'm Gail Pringle, committee member.
Okay, Angela.
Angela Perry. I'm the the executive director for the OPCC.
Stephen.
Just making sure I'm not on mute. Stephen Camus, one of the ethics committee members.
Okay, Linda.
Hi, Linda James, one of the ethics committee members.
Okay, Lynn.
Lynn Richards, ethics committee member.
Okay, I can see Rich at the top of my screen.
Yeah, Rich Moore, Detective Superintendent, Head of PSD. I'm normally here in my capacity of PSD representative, but Mr. Nixon can't be here, so he's asked me just to pick up some of the papers. So likewise, not usually done it in that position before. So yeah, that's why I'm here, and that's what I'll be doing.
Well, we're grateful to have you here, and as a new chair, we'll be kind to you if you're kind to me.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
I think I see Teresa at the top of the screen.
Hi, yes, Teresa Wilcox, Business Staff Officer for Lord Bark in the OPCC, here to take the minutes today. The meeting is also being recorded. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Is there anybody else on screen that I can't see who we haven't introduced? I'm sorry if that's the case, but
Lois has just joined us, Mark.
Oh, I can't see her. Lois, hello. Can you hear us?
Hi.
Hello, Lois. Hi, Lois. We can hear you, but we can't see
sorry,
you.
I'm here.
Great. Super duper. Just doing a round of introductions, Lois. Did you hear that? Okay. Welcome to the meeting. Let's know how we're going on. Okay, we've got an agenda to move through this afternoon, and we've already done to some extent some of the issues of agenda item 1, which is apologies. I've got Karen, who can't be with us this afternoon, and Rob Nixon, who can't be here this afternoon. Are there apologies from anybody else, Angela, that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, no, Chair.
I think we've got everybody we're expecting, so that's great. Welcome to the meeting. Let's move on through that to agenda item 2, which is urgent business. Can I just ask? Yeah.
Before you start, I think there's 2 other guests on the call. There's Chris Keeley and Sally Blair that you've not introduced.
I do beg your pardon. It's because I can't see you on
the fine.
Screen. Thank you. That's really, thank you for telling me that. And Chris, and I can't see you, but are you here?
I am here, and perhaps you can see me as well. I'm Chris Keeley. I'm Head of Communications for Leicestershire Police.
Hello, Chris. I can see you now, but because I'm working on a small device, you sort of drop in and out as you're talking. And there's an additional person as well that I failed to spot. Who was that?
Sally.
Hello, Sally. Are you with us? Hello, Sally. Yeah. Okay. I think we need, she's perhaps dropped out just for a second, but we need to move forward. Thanks for letting me know that. Okay, we've got apologies from Karen and Rob, as I said, at agenda item number 1. Let's move on to agenda item number 2, which is any urgent business. So first and foremost, any urgent business from any of the members of the committee, and I'll come to the officers second. So any of the members want to raise anything urgently under agenda item 2? I'll take silence as a no. Okay, any officers want to raise any urgent items of business under agenda item 2? Again, I'll take silence as a no.
No, we've not been notified of any at all, Chair. Thank you.
Brilliant. Let's move on to, thanks everybody. Agenda item 3, it's the usual issue about any declarations of interest. So I'll just ask the generic question. Are there any declarations of interest that people wish and are appropriate to be made here? And I'll read silence to that question as no. Brilliant. Let's move on to agenda item number 4. On this basis, we'll be finished by 2:30. The minutes of the last meeting. Last meeting was on 18th of December 2020. There are 5 pages of minutes which you should have had circulated to you. I'll do what we normally do with the minutes, and I'll move through them page by page. So obviously I'm going to start with 1 and get to 5. So if you have read them, go to page 1. If you haven't read them, have a quick read of page number 1. So it's the minutes from 18/12/20. It's page 1 of the minutes. Are they an accurate reflection of the discussion that we had? Are there any points arising from the minutes that people want to raise? Page 1, please. Just give it a couple of seconds. Okay, page 2.
So yes, Chair. So let's see item 3420, stop and search, which is the headings on page 1. On page 2, we've got those bulleted points. So the 2 items there. Bullet point number 4 on the I asked for if the statistics that are used to make the claim that a black person is 5.3 times more likely to be an offender of knife crime. I asked for those statistics to be placed before the committee so we could scrutinise them and see if they were robust. And I know that is not in the role in action. So I'm wondering if we're going to get those. And the next point, so the next bullet point, the final sentence in the minutes say the committee acknowledged that the disproportionality was not evidence of racism. That's not quite what we said. What we said is that the committee acknowledged that the disproportionality was not necessarily. It may be, or there may be other factors which explain that. And I think at the moment that sentence is misleading in terms of what we actually said. It could be answered by adding not necessarily.
Okay. So there are 2 issues there, Steve, if I can try and summarise. One is to make sure that we get the request for the stats that you talked about to amend the minutes, I beg your pardon, to reflect that. And the second one is a matter of accuracy in respect of that last sentence. And I agree with you. It would just seem adding not necessarily. Would that be acceptable to you, Stephen?
Yeah.
In terms of accuracy. Everybody else okay with those 2 changes?
I've got one more thing, Mark. In regards to Iris, she attended the meeting, but she actually cut off, so she wasn't able to provide us with any viewpoints in regards to the report. So is there any way that there's been any comments? We could find out if she has had any comments or she gave a report given that she couldn't attend the meeting.
She got sort of booted out, didn't she, sort of electronically?
Yeah.
I suspect we don't have that for this afternoon. Would that be the case, Angela?
Yeah, we haven't heard anything from Iris. The recording is made available, so I can't confirm whether Iris was able to retrospectively listen to the discussion or not. But if she has, we haven't heard any feedback from her.
Okay, I suppose the double check here would be, could we contact her perhaps by email to say that the recording is available for her to listen to? If she hasn't already and she wants to, she can listen to it. And if she has comments following that it won't now be till the next committee meeting, so it'll be sometime into the future, but to just leave the doorway open for her if she wants to come back. Does that catch it, Linda? Okay. So we're on page 2 of the minutes. Are there any other issues of accuracy or additions to page 2 before we move to page 3? Let's move to
Chair,
page.
sorry, can I interrupt? I have read the papers, but I'm now struggling to open the documents. I wonder if any of the administrators could actually share the documents on screen, if that's possible.
I'm trying to do that at the moment. Just bear with me. Thank you.
Okay. On that basis, would it be a good idea if we came back to the minutes? Because otherwise we're going to have a bit of a pause at this point, aren't we? I'm keen that you actually have an opportunity to have a look at them before we sign them.
I have seen them. I've read all the paperwork. I'm just, because I've got a suite of documents online, I'm trying to go into the documents as we come to them.
There you go, I'm displaying them now. Can you see?
It would be easy for me if I could see them on screen, which I can now. Thank you, Teresa.
That's brilliant. Well, let's go back a step then. This is the 5-page document of minutes. Let's just go back to page 2 of the minutes. Thank you, Teresa. And just give you a second to have a look at page 2 again if you don't have it in front of you. And then we'll move on to page 3. I'll just give you a couple of seconds to have a look at that. Okay, we've got the issues that Stephen and Linda raised. Let's move on to page 3 of the minutes from 1812. Thanks, I can see them scrolling up. Here we come. So page 3, issues of accuracy, any issues of omission. Just give you a couple of extra seconds. I'm going to read silence as you're happy with page 3. Can see it scrolling up on my page in front of me. Hopefully everybody also can see that. Okay, let's move on to page 4, please. Okay, again, I've got page 4 in front of me. Hopefully you can all see it as well. Issues of accuracy or omission. This is the second to last page, page 4, and I can see it scrolling up in front of me. Any issues from anybody? Okay, good. Let's move on to the final page of the minutes, page 5. And you don't need me to talk about errors of omission or accuracy because I've said it 4 times already. Okay, we've got that in front of us. Thank you, Teresa. Any issues from the final page of the minutes that people want to raise? Great, thanks, Teresa. Can I then ask colleagues just to accept the minutes from 1812 with the additions that we've just talked about as a full and fair record of the meeting and sign them off? Again, I'm going to take silence as a yes to that. Brilliant. So that's the declarations and minutes done. Can we move on, please, to agenda item number 5, which relates to paper A in your document pack? That's the impact of COVID-19 of delivery of services. And Rich, I think we're going to hand over. Oh, beg pardon, Lynn, I've just seen you put your hand up.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I was a bit delayed with that. It was actually a comment at the end of the meeting. In our meeting earlier, we were wondering whether it was possible for us to have the draft minute much earlier in the proceedings, i.e. a couple of weeks after the last meeting, if that would be possible going forward. And also members mentioned that it would be good if we had a default position on our choice of printed or electronic, so that we don't have that question each time, but that we can just say going forward, can we have this? If we can.
Lynn, sorry to cut across you. So in terms of a default position, are you talking about each of us saying, I would either like it electronically or on paper, not us having a blanket where
not blanket, but each making a choice and we just stick with that, so that we don't need to be asked.
Yeah, and that saves people's time. So is everybody happy with the idea of being contacted subsequent to this meeting, just to with an email say, here henceforward I'd want to be contacted, I want papers electronically, or I want them on paper, I suppose you could say you wanted them both electronically or on paper. So there's 3 possible choices, but for that to be thereafter become your default position for papers at subsequent meetings, that seems sensible. And as far as getting the drafts of the minutes to members earlier than they currently are delivered, I suppose, Angela, I just need to come back to you at that point. Is that practically possible?
Yes, it is, Chair.
Okay, well, perhaps then within 2 weeks of each meeting, 2 to 3 weeks maybe gives you a bit more space and time. We'd expect the minutes to be available to us and the papers to follow them, either electronically or on paper as we set as our defaults. Everybody happy with that? Lynn, does that cover what you wanted to ask?
It does,
Yes,
indeed.
Chair. Yeah.
Okay, super. Thanks. I'm sorry, Lynn. I just didn't notice you'd got your hand up there. So apologies for moving on a little quickly there. Let's move back to agenda item 5, which relates to paper A, the impact of COVID-19 on operational delivery. And I think, Rich, in Mr. Nixon's absence, I'll hand over to you. I can see the paper in front of me, and unless I hear otherwise from everybody else, I'll assume that you can too. So, Rich, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. If anybody's got any questions, feel free to obviously interrupt. Obviously, I assume everyone's read it. It's on the screen, so I'm just going to pick out the main points and we can sort of move quickly onto the discussion. So, as you expect, really challenging year trying to see through this. There's no blueprint for dealing with COVID. It's unprecedented. We've never dealt with it as a police service, and no one else has either. So it is a particularly difficult sort of year we've had. So I'll just pick out the sort of key headlines. So over 25,000 COVID related incidents since March 2020, a 13% increase in the priority response incidents, which we would locally know as a grade 2 incident, over 300 different COVID regulations, which have been amended 16 times. Recorded crime did initially drop, then returned to normal levels. So not only are we dealing with normal business, actually dealing with the COVID related demand on top of that. And as I said, 25,000 COVID related incidents. Domestic abuse increased by 10.8% during that same period. The total cost of force was 1.9 million. That's a rolling total, but we do expect to see most of that coming back into force through the Home Office. So during this period of time, the new target operating model was implemented in April 2020. That was all pre-planned, but it was just the timing was just after we'd gone into lockdown, we sort of knew target operating had been implemented. So that saw the installation of 9 neighbourhood policing areas. That's an increase from 8. We had a COVID gold structure in place, which was the strategic direction for managing normal business whilst also dealing with the COVID crisis as well. And below that sat a delivery cell, which was the operational part of the sort of COVID delivery, making sure that officers are sort of equipped with PPE, making sure we continue to deliver business and making sure that we are sort of adhering to the ever-changing government guidelines. Also, the SCG, Strategic Coordinating Group, was up and running, and we obviously continued to play a part in that, but significantly we were chairing that, or Mr. Nixon was certainly chairing that in the very early stages. So obviously there was a lot of work going on in the early stages to try and get an understanding of what was happening, how to sort of implement that, and how to sort of continue to deliver policing across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. We obviously adopted the 4 E's approach, which was the standard approach from the Home Office and the College of Police, in which you've probably all no doubt heard lots of, which was the engage, explain, encourage and enforce. And that was a particularly useful framework for managing what is an unprecedented policing response for the COVID crisis. And out of that, over 2,500 fixed penalty notices have been issued since sort of March 2020. And then on top of that, 79 COVID related complaints have been received by the force. So interestingly, the ethical dilemmas that are sort of raised here are: how do we prioritise COVID breaches without impacting on normal service delivery? As I said, on top of normal business, we've had the increase in domestic abuse, we've had the increase in COVID related incidents. And what degree of discretion do officers have for using the 4 E's? So they're the sort of ethical issues raised from sort of policing COVID. But out of this, there is some positive impact as well. As I said, we implemented the new target operating model in April 2020, and what that has seen is some sort of positive things coming out of this. So positive outcomes, which is the way we detect crime, has been improving gradually. The satisfaction from our victims has been improving as well. Response time, certainly for grade 2, has improved, and the timeliness of answering 101 calls, which is the non-emergency, has certainly been quicker in recent periods. And the positive public support we've had from research that has been completed, I think over 60% of people believe that they support the way that the national policing approach has sort of maintained sort of policing during this COVID crisis. So, in a nutshell, that is the paper. I've sort of just picked up on the major points because no doubt everybody's read it. It's on screen, but I just wanted to sort of pick up the major points and some of the major data within that, just to sort of prompt the discussion. So, Mark, as chair, I'll sort of pass back to you for sort of any further discussion now around those points that I've raised.
Thanks very much, Rich. Thanks for going through that so succinctly. I'd just say before we come back to this paper, I was so keen and enthusiastic to talk about it that I missed rolling actions off the agenda. We'll come back to that, but let's look at the paper that's in front of us rather than taking a retrograde step at this point. I just remind members of the committee that at our last meeting, we had a look at 2 video clips around policing through the pandemic. They were both breaking up parties or sort of gatherings of different descriptions. One was a house party, if you remember, and one was a wedding reception or a sort of wedding reception in somebody's back garden. We had opportunity to discuss how those actions were carried forward. Interestingly, I think only a day or 2 days after our Ethics and Integrity meeting, I saw the video clip of the police breaking up the house party on the national news. So it was interesting to sort of think, where have I seen this before? We've got a couple of questions that have ethical baselines in front of us. The first one is, how should Leicestershire Police prioritise additional reports of COVID-19 regulation breaches without impacting on existing services? I mean, in some senses, you'll forgive me, I'm a bit of a old academic here. Without seems to be the wrong word. I don't want to be too semantic about it, but if there's additional demand, it cannot have no carryover consequences for existing services. So it would be a better question in some way if it said, whilst minimising impact on existing services, but I'm just being super picky. In a sense, that's what you pay me for. What are people's views around the table of this first ethical question about prioritising COVID-19 regulation breaches? Lynn, I can see you've raised your hand. Please chip in. I'm having difficulty seeing who has got their hands up, so please just talk.
Thank you very much. I suppose my thought is I don't think they should be prioritised over and above, other than in the normal decision-making model and taking a risk assessment of how you see what's in front of you and how you can use your resources. So my view is that they shouldn't be prioritised.
Okay. I mean, certainly the 2 examples that we saw video clips of last time around, Lynn, didn't present huge risk to large numbers of people. The house party was a reasonably large number of people, but is it a blanket, you shouldn't prioritise it, or is it, if there's significant risk to sort of life and limb?
Yeah, I think it should be taken as you would any other business in front of officers at any point, which is you would take a view on what needs to be done, what is the risk, and what isn't being done while you're attending to this. So I would expect that to be a view taken no different than you would for any other.
Well, can I push you a bit about that?
Business.
I think you're moving on, and I can see Gail's got her hand up. I'll come to you in a moment, Gail. you're almost addressing the issue that's in question 2 here, which is about what degree of discretion should police apply. And really, if I'm putting words in,
I think that's different. I think that's a different question, actually, because one is about how are you using your resources, and are you prioritising one sort of business over another? The question's asking us, are we prioritising COVID over other things? And I'm saying the police are making those decisions every single day on where they put their resources, and I don't think COVID should be given, special COVID breaches should be given special attention. That's what I'm saying on that point. But where we come to when that resource is being used for a COVID related incident, for example, and the examples that are given, which are emotive ones, I would be very much on the same lines as the College of Policing, which is that it's very much a last resort about enforcing, and that the 4 E's approach is the way forward, especially with emotive things like funerals and vigils. And we've seen the police in Leicestershire, we're so fortunate, we've seen them deal with very, very emotive gatherings before, admittedly before the current regulations were in place. And it was really wonderful to see how sensitively things were handled. I know it's more tricky now, I do understand that, but we've seen the negative impact of, shall we say, going over the top in the news enough recently from other forces.
Thanks, Lena. As ever,
perhaps
brilliant.
I didn't make myself very clear, really. Sorry.
No, I think that was very clear. In fact, I was just going to say that. Gail, can I come on to you?
Yeah, it was to echo Lynn's point, really, and I think just to I'm probably straying into the second question as well, but I think really it's not so much a question of prioritising one above the other, but really looking at it proportionately, and ensuring that you use the 4 R's that are there for the police in terms of their discretion, and just be proportionate. So if there isn't a huge risk, or if it's quite a small gathering, I think the police, in all their dealings with the public, have to be proportionate and have to use their discretion.
And that's the professional part. I mean, Lynn is quite right. We have seen very good examples over, all the time the committee's been together, of officers through body-worn camera images and through reports of one type or another, really being quite sensitive, looking at the circumstance and making an informed judgment on their feet. And sometimes they get that right, sometimes they get it, less right. But we have seen plenty of evidence over the last few years of officers really making quite sophisticated judgments, acting proportionally, not wanting to put words in your mouth, Gail. And you're really suggesting that this is no different to anything that we've seen before. It just happens to have a COVID-19 banner to it.
I mean, obviously, COVID is at the forefront of everybody's minds, and there will be. I think one of the difficulties is, if the police get, somebody calling in or a report that something's happening, there will be that obligation to respond. But they have to weigh that up with, whatever else is being called in at the time, whether it's, a 999 call, or, as we've said before, someone is at risk of immediate danger. So. Yeah, I mean, we discussed, didn't we, before how well the police handled the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and how we thought that was a really good example of them, policing that event, being present at that event, but that it went really well. However, other forces have shown perhaps a little bit too much force and not used that discretion, and things have not gone as well.
That's really helpful, Stephen. I'm keen to come to you in a moment, just to ask if there are any legal implications to either of these 2 questions. But perhaps we should move on just briefly to the second ethical issue that's presented here. What degree of discretion should Leicestershire Police apply when taking the 4E approach? Should discretion applied vary in emotive situations? For example, one of the examples given is vigils. I can only think that when this was being written, perhaps the Sarah Everard vigil and the policing of that event was at the forefront of the writer's mind, although it doesn't say it specifically. But I think, coming back to you, Gail, you used a really good example from Black Lives Matter, and we saw direct evidence of, quite a sort of permissive, not ill-informed but sensitive policing of the Black Lives Matter campaign that reflected, I think, very well on the police. Certainly, we're not talking about Leicestershire Police here, but there's been plenty of public opprobrium to the policing of the Sarah Everard vigil, which I think could have been handled with greater sensitivity. Are there other points of view around the table? Okay. Stephen, are there any legal issues that we need to just be attuned to here?
Excuse me, I was trying to speak previously and I realised I was muted. I'd like to address before thinking about the legal issues, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I do see both of these bullet points and point 5 in these questions as being very much interrelated. And I think Lynn's right. They are, in some senses, very much part of mainstream policing. And the question as to, and I think some of the early comments sort of suggested a distinction between the prioritisation in a strategic level and then what happens on the ground in terms of what individual officers do and how they exercise discretion. But importantly, one should never forget that those strategic questions and patterns are a result of individual exercises of discretion on a daily basis, and I think they both link into each other in very obvious ways. Going back to the prioritisation and how should and I think as part of that, how should discretion be used and relied upon? What we've got with the COVID regulations is something which is very different from a lot of other criminal offences. We've got some straightforward examples of behaviour which are breaches of the regulation unless done with a reasonable excuse. So from a criminal law point of view, that's pretty straightforward. What's different is that really what we're dealing with here is we would describe in a criminal law point of view what is an endangerment offence.
Yeah.
We have these restrictions because we're trying to reduce a possible risk. And an example that you could give as the perfect endangerment offence is speeding. Speeding in itself might be perfectly safe, but it's about that general collective risk, and that's why we enforce speed limits. It's why we enforce drink driving. So it's not that harm is then caused, it's we're trying to reduce the risk of harm. And that's clearly what's happening with COVID. And then, so officers are used to seeing a breach, say, of driving and going, right, is it worth my while intervening here? And the sorts of decision-making processes that we'd expect are the same that you would get in terms of individual decision-making exercise discretion, but also in terms of prioritising resources. So remember, it was a long time ago now when we went to the contact management centre. Their centres, the acronym was THRIVE, was it not? It was about the threats, the risk, if that materialised. And I think the COVID regulation should be enforced in pretty much the same way. What's the degree of risk? Is this a group? A large group? In what context are we in terms of the pandemic? I think all of those are interesting things. But I think it might have been Gail touched upon this. We've got with COVID, however, something very different because we've got a collective sense of we're all trying to deal with this collectively.
Yep.
And if the police aren't responding to individual complaints, that has the potential to erode public confidence in our collective response and what we're trying to do collectively. So I think there were two things to take into account there. That there's what's the risk from that particular gathering or that particular regulations, and then but combined with that, if we don't do anything, how does that look? Is that going to erode public confidence, not just in the police but also in the regulations and the scheme? And therefore, that suggests that there should be more intervention sometimes. And finally, Matt, I think before talking about potential legal aspect, I would agree with you in that in terms of how you said that should be questioned as well. I think because COVID is something new, it can't not impact upon what the police generally do. The question then is, where does the balance lie between their standard everyday day responsibilities and what they do in this new context?
Well, I was going to respond right at the end of this by talking about it, but you made the comparison with speeding, for example, and pretty much everybody is aware of what the speed limits are in a town or on a motorway, and they've been consistent for a long period of time. And I was going to say, you know, that is different to COVID, where we were dealing with an unprecedented circumstance, as Rich said in his introduction. And I can't remember, Rich, you can perhaps put me right, that not only were the regulations completely new, but they changed, did you say 16 times?
Yeah, they did over the time. They changed again, and like I say, it caused confusion. And just to sort of compound that, so the government would make changes, they were unclear, so that people would ring our control room to ask for guidance. So yeah, you're right, there was some real confusion out there.
So I suppose
I think on that as well, one of the important points is that there was also, you know, a lot of confusion as to what were in the regulations and what was in the guidance. So a number of police forces were enforcing the guidance, which wasn't legally enforceable. What you needed to enforce what was in the regulations as well. I think that's a really important part of this process.
Okay, let's, I mean, I'd be interested if other people have got other points of view that they haven't had an opportunity to share, to have a chance to say what you think now. But let me try, while you're thinking about if you've got extra things to say, to come to some sort of summary in relation to these two questions. In terms of officers exercising a soft touch, a degree of discretion, I don't think anybody around the committee table is saying no, officers shouldn't exercise discretion and should, you know, and should take a fairly mechanical approach to enforcing the regulations. I've made the point just now that I think that with COVID regulations being completely new, and also with them changing reasonably rapidly across a short period, we're asking a lot of officers to exercise discretion if they feel they are sort of standing on shifting stand. And, you know, what yesterday were the regulations might not be the regulations today. So that might have some impact. I think Stephen has made two really clear points around differentiating between direct risk posed and, secondly, the risk of not doing something sort of eroding general confidence in the police overall. Is that a fair summary, folks, of our responses to those two questions? I'm going to take silence as yes, I think.
Just out of interest, Mark, Chris has had his hand up for some time.
Oh, I do beg your pardon, Chris. Please do speak up. I can't see that on my little device here.
I'm sorry, Mark. That's my mistake. I don't normally hold back in speaking up, as Rich and Angela will testify, but I defer to the chair.
Go ahead.
I thought the committee might just to add to the context. You know, picked up a couple of the conversations that have, or points that have already been made around prioritisation and discretion, and it was Stephen that raised the point about context. That 16 changes in regulations from a comms perspective, as you can imagine, both external comms and internal comms, because we took an approach where we had to build from inside out. Our officers and staff had to understand what the situation was before they're engaging with the public. That was a big ask. I also, you know, just remind you that as context, we were operating two different legal frameworks at one point, where parts of the county, or the two counties and the city, were in two different places, and we had to make that clear and reassure the public at the same time that we were trying to get those things across. And I just, for context, just to add what it might be in the report there was an agenda item at every gold meeting to do with our COVID response for a quality impact and looking at how communities are responding to this. Secondly, that we put a lot of emphasis into our digital channels, bolstering, targeting particular communities where we felt that messages weren't necessarily getting through, and we changed languages in order to be able to try and access those communities, working largely with LLR partners. particularly health, but as part of the kind of emergency response that has been running throughout the year, and Rich mentioned in his report. And the third bit is a very fundamental point. It's just about listening, and that has been key for how we've tried to support some of the decision making that's been going there. Yes, through our officers on the ground. Yes, across our digital channels, but also that public mood. People asked about that discretion point between business as usual, getting out and being shown that we're tackling crimes that are still happening, as well as dealing with COVID. And that had to be done from reading public mood and understanding the wider context that we were in, particularly for Leicester, given how long it's been has been in the toughest levels of restrictions. I just wanted to share that context with if that were useful.
It is useful. Thank you for that. So I think in terms of just giving an overall answer to these two questions, I'm keen that we not just talk about the questions, but try to come back with a response which might be of use to the officers who are raising this. The first one is about prioritising, and it would seem to me to be the view of the committee that actually this shouldn't be that different to how officers prioritise their actions in other areas. And secondly, what degree of discretion should the police have in applying these matters into effect? And we are recognising that it's a complex and evolving situation with rapidly changing and shifting sand in terms of what the regulations actually are. I think it's a really useful point you just made about really good communication within the form, keeping everybody up to speed. I suppose the devil's advocate question, and I'll promise I'll shut up at this point from me, would be if an officer in good faith used discretion that latterly proved to be a mistake, but was done in the best interests and with no other agenda other than trying to do the right thing, would he or she be supported by the police? It's a difficult thing. It's a complex and sophisticated thing that we're asking people to do. So it's not just about getting it right, it's how the police would respond as an organisation, particularly senior managers, if an officer working with good intention, the best of their ability, on the basis of their interpretation of evolving regulations, makes a mistake, that they would not be, they'd be held accountable for that, but people would understand the context in which that officer would work.
Can I come back on this, Chair? Because I recognise this is an important point, and I recognise that there were shifting sands and there were a lot of changes to the regulations. But I think an important part of that is that's a fundamental part of policing. A fundamental part of policing is interpreting and applying the law as to whether to make decisions as to whether someone's committed an offence and therefore whether they can be arrested for it. But also then important questions around process, procedure, and the police are the organisation who enforce the law. I think at a bare minimum we expect them to make, and it sounds like they have made good efforts, but at least make efforts to know what it is that they actually are enforcing. I take the context entirely that mistakes were going to be made, and I'm not saying, and I think actually we've spoken about this in the past, that in some circumstances it's really good to say complaints, for instance, moving increasingly towards a lessons learned rather than a punitive process. And I think that part of it is really important. But I think we can overplay the context and not recognise that this is what the police do. I can see Richard's put his hand up, so I'd be interested to see his responses to that.
I'll come back to you in a moment, Rich. I just want to push back a little bit, Stephen. I mean, I think it's unusual to hear that regulations change 16 times within a 1-year period. So that does put the context here into a slightly different setting. That's a lot to keep on top of. It's almost a daily agenda setting exercise. But Rich, I'm sorry to take time from you. Did you want to respond?
Yeah, it's just very quickly. Like I said, we are a learning organisation, and actually we don't get it right every time, and particularly with like the shifting sands of the regulations. So we've had 79 related COVID complaints, which actually I think is relatively low compared to other forces. But we have seen complaints where people think we haven't got it right. That there's complaints around the use of PPE, but actually they're dealt with as low level matters as they are. But actually we decide whether the service that's been provided is acceptable or not. And if it's not, we learn from it, and we all move on very quickly. And that's the kind of ethos of the new conduct and complaint regulations that came in February 2020. So that ethos is sort of been with us all the way through the year, and we've had a very, very sensible approach to this. But this has been about learning, and that's how we've dealt with a vast majority of complaints that have come in.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. I think that's been a very useful discussion. I was very interested, Rich, by one of the points that you made in your verbal report about there having been a 10.8% increase in domestic abuse over this period, which I'm picking on just because it leapt off the page at me as I read it. And I should have said at the outset, so I apologise for not doing so, that the committee this morning had a really very good presentation from your colleague Devya Singh around the new target operation model that you referred to in your presentation, and to sort of formally record that we've had that, and that it was an excellent presentation, and thanks to Devya for doing that. I think that's, unless there are other points that people haven't had an opportunity to make, or hands up that I cannot see, can we bring that?
Not quite, please, Chair. We had a discussion this morning in your absence around something that was that's COVID related and policing of COVID, but we dealt with in the last meeting, and particularly when we observed a stop and search that resulted from a COVID enforcement, and a number of us expressed what we regard as problematic aspects of that example of policing that we observed, and in particular the main issue that we drew out was that it looked to us, or certainly looked to me, and I think some colleagues agreed with that it looked to me that the stop and search that took place resulted not because that was what was driving the interaction, but the stop and search took place because the individual who was subject to the discussion around the COVID regulations simply wasn't playing ball. And it looked to me that one of the officers then went, okay, you're not going to play ball, we're going to start talking coercive powers, and then engage in a stop and search. So in the literature, it's often described on arrest, but it's a contempt of court. If you don't play ball, if you don't appear to be compliant, we're going to rely upon our coercive powers. Now, we noted that, and we between meetings we did get a response via email around that. And I think, again, I'm not going to speak for all colleagues, but I know I'm speaking for more than just me. The response was disappointing, because I think the response seemed to miss the point of the issue that I was raising. One of the things I think I clearly said was that if you look at what it means to have reasonable suspicion for a stop and search, you could probably make a case for there being reasonable suspicion in that instance. But that wasn't the point that we were making, because that's the response we got. The response we got was there were grounds here, so this was a lawful stop and search. Our question was not whether it was lawful in that context. The question was whether it was ethical. So if we think that the code of ethics is supposed to be core of decision making, is it ethical to rely upon those coercive powers when, as it appeared to us, this was a show of power? This was about control. This was about showing to the suspect who was boss. So there may well have been a legal basis, but we didn't think that was particularly ethical. And the response that we got didn't address that question of the ethics of that stop and search. It only addressed the lawfulness.
Steve, do you want to?
I think Gail's got a hand up as well.
She has. I'll come to you in a second, Gail. Stephen, that's a really interesting point. You want to push that back to ask for more detail, and for the question that we asked last time to be addressed more appropriately and fully.
I don't know how other people feel. I just actually wanted it noted that I was dissatisfied with that response. That I don't think that really engaged with the point that we were making. Whether or not the officer who did respond wants to come back on that, I don't know, and I don't necessarily feel we need to push that. I think I just want it recorded.
Yeah, and of course, I would suggest that that needs to be clearly stated in the minutes. And as you know, Stephen, this is being recorded in the real sense of the word. So hopefully we can catch your expression exactly correctly there. Gail, sorry to keep you waiting.
No problem. I just wanted to just really echo the points that Steve has been making. And I don't actually think that, I think really it was a frustration around the disappointing response that we got. I mean, I'm not going to go over the discussion that we had at the time because it was a very full discussion. My particular issue was around what I felt was disproportionate. You know, there were a number of officers who attended that incident at the time. And I remember asking the question about the age of the suspect because he looked very young to me. And then it did transpire that the young person was underage. So I don't think it's probably going to be useful. I think we're probably going to get a similar response. So I'm not looking for another response. I just really would like it noted that, you know, we were disappointed with what we got back. We do still stand by the fact that we felt, well, I'm standing by the fact that it may have been legal, but I think it was unethical, which is kind of the whole point of this committee. So I just really wanted to reinforce Stephen's point because I think there's quite a lot of strength of feeling in our discussion.
Okay, I think so noted. Thank you both for raising those issues and thanks for having the discussion. I had to drop out of the preliminary meeting this morning because I've been to a child death overview panel. I'd much sooner have stayed with you guys, I have to say to you. So thank you for taking that discussion forward in my absence and for making sure that it's voiced here. So Rich, thank you for that. Thank you for paper A at agenda item 5. I'm going to bring the discussion on that matter to a conclusion at this point, but I'm going to take a step back as far as the agenda is concerned to ask about rolling actions. Angela, can you pick this one up?
Yes, absolutely, Chair, I will do. Looking at the action sheet then, I can certainly, I'll speak about the actions I can speak about, and Rich, I don't know whether you can pick the others up that are on the fourth side of the House, but action 8 regarding stop and search and the coercive powers invite, that's done and it's on your forward plan when that comes before the committee again. And likewise for action 19 over the page, that is, it hasn't happened yet, but it's on the forward plan of work for you to see those again, those videos again. So it will come before the committee, and as you know, we deal with the chair as and when what's on the agenda at what time. Rich, I don't know if there's anything you can say on all the other actions on the sheet.
Yeah, the only one I can update on is action 33, which is around the use of body-worn video and how long the footage is stored for. I can actually confirm that body-worn video footage will remain for 28 days unless it's marked for evidential purposes. If it's marked for evidential purposes, it will remain on the system. So there is a default position, 28 days. Everything that we record will remain there for 28 days unless you mark it's evidential. If not, it is, well, it goes, but my team can certainly access that anyway. But it's just to sort of clarify that point. I don't think there's any potential for that to be extended, but all officers and staff in force know what the procedure is. They know what the guidelines are. So occasionally we will be asked to try and recover it, and in most cases we can. So that's kind of the update for 33. Unfortunately, I can't update on any of the other points. So Chair, if you're okay for them to be carried over until the next meeting.
Yes, I'm okay with that. Is that okay with everybody else around the table? I'll take silence as yes. Great. Okay, I think we've dealt with rolling actions. Thank you, Rich, and thank you, Angela, for your clarity and brevity there. I'm sorry, Rich, we're going to come back to you, aren't we?
No problem.
At agenda item 6, which is related to paper B, which should be in your document pack, and it's around mental health demand profiling and guidance. Can I hand to you, Rich?
Yes, certainly, Chair. Again, I'll just cover the main points because everyone can see it hopefully on the screen, and I think everyone's had a chance to read it prior to this. So this talks about the scale of mental health related demand for Leicestershire Police and the guidance given to officers. And I think the landscape is changed beyond all recognition in the last 10 years. Mental health issues cut across all aspects of policing. Officers will become involved in dealing with mental health on most days, most duties. These are really complex matters. They involve people with extremely complex needs, and police officers are not trained to deal with people with mental illness. And actually, I think if somebody is in mental health crisis, I think the last person they need to see is a police officer in uniform. So I think that can sometimes exacerbate the situation. So that's the kind of the context to the kind of the paper. So we've had to adapt. We've had to put structures in place because, unfortunately, we do become the last resort. We do get the calls when somebody's in crisis, and is that as a result of gaps in other service provision across the landscape. So we do have the mental health triage car. We do have liaison and diversion in the custody suites. We do have the PAVE team, which is the proactive adult vulnerability engagement team. We do have a mental health partnership officer, and mental health crisis is where most of our demand comes from. So that will take the form of suicide, missing from homes, disorderly conduct, erratic behaviour, violent behaviour, public safety. As I said, we do become the emergency service that kind of picks up the consequences of this and some of the issues with this. And I say, not in most cases, we're probably not the right people to deal with it, but we've had to adapt. We've had to put structures, processes in place in order to manage this, because it is complex, and if we don't get it right, there can be serious consequences for the individual in terms of the person that may be suffering from mental health, and also the officers involved as well. So in terms of the triage car, that is a joint venture with Leicestershire Police and Leicestershire Partnership Trust, providing one officer, one uniformed police officer and one nurse for each early and late shift, 7 days a week. And the team comprised of 4 full-time officers and 12 mental health practitioners. And this was fairly groundbreaking when it first started. I think we were one of, if not the first force to introduce this, and this was about teaming up with our partners and actually utilising people that actually are trained to deal with mental health. So they will triage all the incidents coming into the police. So on average 769 incidents every calendar month they will triage. They will review service users' mental health history, and that's the benefit of having the mental health practitioner, because we can access the systems. It puts us in a much better position to decide on how to deal with that incident, because, as I said, we're probably not the best people to be dealing with it. We're not trained, so actually having that practitioner with us makes all the difference, because it provides that information, it provides that guidance in terms of how to successfully and effectively manage that incident, because they are risky. They do have a lot of risk and threat attached to them. So the triage car will typically spend 15 to 25 minutes per incident reviewing and supplying information, and it's that information that's crucial that we've never had before, and that really does sort of set us up in terms of making sure we deal with incident properly, making sure we get the right agency there. The liaison and diversion team, they're set up in our custody suite, and therefore, I mean, I think we probably all know that a lot of people going through the custody system have mental health issues. So I think this is a really sort of good team to have, because this is right at the sharp end in terms of the people coming into custody to identify that they may have a mental health issue, and actually they get the liaison and diversion there and then. We're not waiting for it to get to crisis point. Actually, there's an opportunity here, and that also sort of pertains to sort of outreach work as well. So I think that's a particularly good system that's in place, because we know that that's the point where we will come across a lot of people with mental health issues. So what better place than to try and sort of engage at that point with professionals, and I think that's the key point, with professionals who are trained to deal with this. The PAVE team, I'll say it's relatively new. I think it's been going sort of 3 or 4 years now, and this is around trying to manage demand that actually it's unnecessary demand. This is adults with mental health issues that they're contacting the police a lot, but actually when you look at it, they're probably contacting partners equally. And actually this is about joined up working between local police teams, community mental health, housing teams, Turning Point and other services to try and help support the service user and actually try and prevent that repeated demand, because I think when you look at some of the case, I mean, I did used to work in the control room, and I know the inordinate amount of time spent on one particular individual because they kept phoning and phoning. They clearly needed help, but actually, how do you help them and how do you prevent the demand? But I think there's some really good case studies out there where I've actually sort of helped individuals, and it's cut the amount of time that they are contacting the police significantly. I think when you sort of start putting a monetary sort of value on that, it's significant. A time value, it's significant. So there's some real value in this team. So that again, it's multi-agency, and this is how it should be, working with others in order to try and support service users and sort of try and reduce that unnecessary demand. The mental health partnership officer that acts as a liaison between Leicestershire Partnership Trust and Leicestershire Police. Role is to facilitate sharing of information. Again, absolutely key, making sure everybody's got the right information, which allows us to sort of make effective decisions and make sure that we are implementing more efficient and effective working practices. So that really is key. Again, it's just making sure that we're all working towards the same goals here, and we're all sort of using each area of specialty in order to make sure we come together as partner agencies to manage the demand and manage the individuals effectively and make sure they get the necessary support. So on the paper, there's just a bit of a snapshot in terms of a month 2021, January.
Yes.
So that just gives you a bit of an overview of some of the demand, and then also talks about the number of Section 136 powers. This is the police power where we've got somebody in a public place that is in immediate care of need of care and control, and we can detain them to a place of safety. That is completely turned on its head in terms of the use of the mental health triage card, because we don't actually use our powers that often now. We certainly don't take people into our custody suites, because I personally don't think that's a place of safety. I think we've recognised that. So I think these are just some of the figures, and the 135s, that's where we've assisted with a warrant to detain a person in mental health crisis. So that kind of just gives you a sort of bit of a snapshot in terms of the demand, the context, and what we've put in place in order to manage what is there is a lot of demand here. There's a lot of complexity, a lot of risk, and a lot of threat, and this is really helping us to sort of see a way forward and actually deal with these matters effectively, efficiently, professionally. So, Chair, over to yourself. If you want to sort of,
I just wanted to check with you before I go to Gail. Firstly, say thanks for that, Rich. I saw Gail put a hand up. I'll come to you in just a second, Gail. I just want to check that these figures they look indicative figures. It's for 1 month, but you mentioned in your presentation that on average there are 769 sort of incidents per month. So the month chosen at 774, there's nothing from your perspective that's unusual or out of order about this. This would be fairly indicative of the month before and the month after. Yeah, it will be. I mean, on an average day, Leicestershire Police can take 700 to 800 incidents a day. So over a month, approximately 700 incidents triaged by the triage car is fairly standard. So there's nothing sort of standing out in respect of that data for January. That's really helpful. Gail, sorry to keep you waiting.
No problem. I just really wanted to commend the force on the work that they were doing. I think, I read the paper and I was really, not surprised, but I was really encouraged by the work that was doing, the specialist work that you're doing, the partnership work that you're involved in. I just really wanted to note that because I think it is commendable. One of the things, you highlighted yourself when you were giving the presentation, is just the sheer numbers of people that you will come into contact with from the public who do have, mental health issues from, different degrees of mental health issues. Yeah. And I know it's obviously, you said that police, your officers aren't trained to deal with this generally, but I wonder if you could give us some information about maybe general awareness raising that you will have with all of your officers kind of frontline. I mean, will you do something? I don't know. Is it something that is touched on when they do their training, their initial training? Because it is such a big issue. Yeah. Everyone's going to come into contact with people with issues at some point. even if they're not specialist staff?
Yeah, certainly. It certainly changed when I first joined. Normally, you have your sort of input around your powers, which is mainly your 136. But now we do the protecting vulnerable persons training, which is widespread, which goes across the force. So, because it is such a big part of policing now, then we have to give the training. Like I said, we're not specialists. We yes, I suppose yes, we are sort of trained to sort of deal with the crisis in terms of how to treat that individual, in terms of how to try and manage it, and the sensitivity, the proportionality, and the sensible nature of dealing with it and being balanced. But it's that specialist knowledge about actually what they're going through. That's what we don't have. But actually, officers are trained. They do recognise the complexity, the difficulty, and the threat and harm and the risk involved in this. So they do get that. And as things change, as things evolve, that training is sort of brought up to date as well.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Rich. I cannot see if you've put your hands up, so please speak up if there are things you want to say. I would like, before we move on, to echo what Gail's just said. She just said it better than I would have done. To be applauded, I think. I read this paper with great interest. It's fair to say that over the years the committee's been in place, we have been presented on a number of occasions with ethical dilemmas around how officers deal with demand that has a mental at its core. And I think particularly the mental health triage car that you've been talking about, Rich, is a really wonderful example of a creative partnership between LPT and Leicestershire Police. It seems to me like an incredibly efficient use of resources across the piece, and the fact that that car is dealing with on average 769 incidents per calendar month is evidence, in addition to that it's a brilliant way, an effective way of combining what the police can offer and what mental health professionals can offer in a way that does exactly what you said in your presentation. It gives us a service that's more appropriate for people who are in distress and are, self-evidently vulnerable. That's brilliant, but it's also more financially efficient. It's sort of double bubble along those lines, and it's to be commended. The only thing that I think I might, again, I'm being a little bit semantic here, I might just pick you up on is, you said a couple of times a police officer in uniform is the last person you want to see if you're in that circumstance. And I'm very well aware that we've got Lois hopefully on the call, who's far more expert in this area than I am. But from my own experience of working in exactly this setting, sometimes a police officer in uniform is exactly the person, because it lends a sense of order and stability and a degree of control to a circumstance. So I think the combination of the triage car and the other mechanisms for engagement that you've talked about is fabulous. But I also think, whilst I don't disagree with you in general terms, perhaps you're being a little bit too hard on your officers in uniform to say it's the last person that somebody wants to see in that circumstance. It's a difficult job, and it's probably not in the wheelhouse of most police officers as the first thing they think about when they put the uniform on. No. But as you very articulately put across, it's a big part of what you are responding to on a day-to-day basis. Fabulous. Are there any other questions or observations that people around the table wish to make?
Hi, Mark, it's Lois. Is it possible for me to ask a couple of questions?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Lois. I'm delighted.
I just wanted to ask really around some of your statistics. So the number of incidents, 774 were triage, but the number of deployments was 58. What exactly does the deployment mean?
Actually going out to the location. So what they will do is they're scanning the incidents as they're coming into Leicestershire Police, and I think there's 774 for January, sort of give an indication of that they are mental health related incidents that they are scanning. So what they will do there is if they need to intervene, they can provide information off the both police systems and the NHS systems. But the deployments is where they've actually gone out to make an assessment in order where the gravity of the situation is so much that actually they've had to deploy.
Yeah, okay. It just seems incredibly low from 774 down to 58.
Yeah.
I just would be interesting to have more data about why those deployments were made against others and to know why. My other question would be, you talked about the PAVE team and their interactions with Turning Point in terms of substance misuse referrals, etc. Is there at any point consideration of substance misuse teams being involved with the triage card? Because when you look across the board with mental health, a large number of, particularly suicidal ideation, tends to come from people either using drugs and alcohol as well. Whether that would be an added bonus for this team or whether it's been considered.
I can't sort of confirm it. I don't think it has been considered. And again, when you start talking about substance misuse and alcohol, again, big part of sort of policing in terms of some of the people that we deal with on a daily basis. So there obviously would be some real benefit there, because again, when you look at the individuals that are going through our custody suite, again, mental health issues, substance misuse issues, and again they potentially go hand in hand as well. So there's definitely some sense in having that link up, but like I don't think that's been considered at the moment.
Well, thank you. My last question would be about overarching roles. So two things. One for support around for police forces, individuals who are attending situations where somebody has actually taken their life, and the support that's offered to officers around that. And secondly, is the bit missing from the report for me is the bit around whose responsibility is what. So in terms of follow-up for people who've witnessed suicides, have been at the scene, whose responsibility is that, mental health or the police, to support those individuals?
I mean, we're talking sort of members of the public, that is sort of the health service in terms of the for the support for them. In terms of officers, we do have a really good offer for wellbeing for officers, and again, this is something that's changed beyond recognition in the last 10 years, that recognition that officers are exposed to primary trauma and the effects that has on post-traumatic stress disorder, and that really is now starting to form a big part of the wellbeing package that's being offered. So officers can access our employee assistance provider, which is health assured, so that they can access, they don't need any authority, they can just pick up the phone and get counselling support 7 days a week. So we've got that. We also run the TRIM process, which is again where people have been involved in traumatic incidents, where we've got a system in place which helps them to deal with that, rather than probably what's happened previously is we've just got on with it, we've just carried on, and then we wonder why in a few years' time that people start to sort of deteriorate, start to develop their own sort of issues. And I think it's indicative of the blue light services in terms, certainly the last sort of 40 years, in terms of you just get on with it. But I think the recognition now is actually it's really important, because the impact that these incidents, not necessarily just the one-off impact of a traumatic incident, but it's the drip effect as well. We recognise that it actually has a big impact. So we're putting a lot of things in place front end, like the TRIM process. We've got access to the health assured employee assistance provider, and then we've also do clinical supervision for some roles within force as well, recognising actually it's a really difficult job, and actually we have to deal with some really difficult things, and actually the welfare provision now is as good as it's ever been for us.
Okay.
Thanks. Because I was looking at the training section, I couldn't see anything about the more trauma focused.
Yeah, so TRIM's not. Yeah, it's not included on there. So that's something we've had the last 3 years, and again, it's just recognition that we do need to provide support for our own staff and officers, because they deal with really difficult stuff on a daily basis.
Just seen a question come across my screen. Can you tell us what the TRIM process is? It sounds like a hair cutting.
Yeah, it's something we've got from the military, and again it's around trauma support, and we've got people that are trained in force. So it's not immediate sort of wraparound. It's sort of days afterwards where officers and staff can access a trained trim individual to sort of debrief the incident, talk them through it, and start to identify if there are any sort of ongoing concerns about what they've witnessed, about what they've seen, what they've dealt with. The whole idea is to sort of deconflate the situation in a controlled way with somebody that's trained and there's someone that can talk to. So I think I've never used it, but I think the whole emphasis is actually you wait sort of 24, 48 hours after the event, and that's when the trim process comes in. But it's based on what the military have been doing for a number of years.
Okay, thanks for that clarity. Lois, I'm going to put words in your mouth here, but you asked a question about sort of teasing apart the number of incidents and the number of deployments, and you're quite right to say 774 to 58 is quite a change, isn't it? It's a big number to quite a small number. So it would be useful if we come back to this, and perhaps we can note for the minutes, to have a bit of insight into how that process works, how the decision-making process works around deployment, which I think would give us greater insight into how the triage car works. Lois, while you're on the line, am I right in remembering that you work for LPT?
I do. I did put it in the chat that I needed to declare it as an interest.
No, it's for me to come back to you and say, if I'm congratulating the police on this creative partnership, I should be congratulating LPT as well. So well done, LPT, as well as Leicestershire Police. Let's be balanced about this. Thanks, colleagues. Thank you, Rich, particularly. I think that's been a very useful and interesting discussion, very full picture being given. Rich, particularly thank you for stepping up into Mr. Nixon's shoes and doing so well with that. Can we move forward, please, unless there are other questions about agenda item 6 to agenda item 7? But before I do so, can I check if Willie Back is with us? I know that he was particular, because it was said at the outset of the meeting that he was particularly keen to be with us at agenda items 7 and 8. Has it been possible for him to join us by phone? Willie, are you there?
I'm going to try and join him now. Just bear with.
Okay. I'm going to move forward in a moment or two to agenda item 7, but let's just give the process a moment or two to see if Willie can join us rather than join in where we've already started speaking.
I can take the report, Chair, to start it off when you're ready.
Okay, Angela, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much. Can we move forward, please, with agenda item 7, which is complaint reviews? Thank
you, Chair. Well, actually, this report was for members' information, really. I'm not sure how much members were aware of the change in legislation that came in under the 2017 Police and Crime Act. It brought in quite a review of the police complaints system, and it brought in different phases. So it seems a long time ago, 2017. We were originally expecting the change as it impacted upon police and crime commissioners to come in on the 1st of April 2019, but it's been pushed back so many times. I think Brexit had some hand in that. However, I have explained about the process, the change, the reasons to make it more impartial, more independent, and to give greater public assurance, really, that the police who deal with complaints that come in from the members of the public, and then the public are unhappy, then review that process themselves. And can I just be clear, we are talking about low-level complaints here. So the Act, when it came in, placed a new responsibility, took it away from the force to review dissatisfaction with the outcome of their complaint against the police, and placed it firmly under a police and crime commissioner as their statutory duty. And I set out the 3 models there that were provided for commissioners to choose from. Our commissioner, along with the largest majority in the country, went for model 1. I think there are 2 forces that went for model 3, and certainly Northamptonshire adopted model 2. Having adopted that model, it began on the 1st of February 2020. there was already, I've explained there was already resource in the force, because of course they were undertaking this function, and we 2P'd over the person who was dealing with that function for the force at the time. Obviously it brought an increase in the office establishment for the commissioner. To move on to the demand, well, clearly things started off very slowly with us, and we expected a rush. We were warned by the IOPC that there would be a significant increase. I don't know what that was based on, but we are now seeing the numbers grow, as you will see from the quite basic table in paragraph 9. So there has been a slight increase on what the force were receiving at the time. Can I just be clear, though, that when it comes to receiving the reviews, the Commissioner does not reinvestigate the complaint. This is all about reasonableness and proportionality in how the force dealt with the original complaint and the outcome.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You've given us a table at point 9 in the document, which shows, you're quite right to say, numbers slightly increasing. They're a relatively low level.
Yes, they are.
Would it be fair to say that irrespective of whatever model a force adopted, and the majority went with model 1, as you've mentioned, the same sort of picture would be true? So that, you know, we wouldn't find that, I don't know, Nottinghamshire and Northamptonshire had huge numbers or were hugely different to what the pattern that you're showing to us for Leicestershire.
Okay, it's a very difficult thing to say because the models are quite different. So
Okay.
model 2 will have a lot more interaction with the complainant. I'm not aware that their numbers are significantly different, but we've only just come really just beyond the first 12 months of this. Okay. And we haven't got lots of data. Anyone who's on model 3, of course, they're having a lot more interaction. They're dealing with really the whole thing. It's a bit difficult to compare, and data is really in its very early stages. So I'm afraid I can't give a more exact answer than that, Chair.
Fair point, well made. You understand why I'm asking the question. A bad question. I should have asked you about other comparative model 1. Police forces have not brought Northamptonshire into the fray.
I'm sure as time goes on, we will be having those comparisons. We certainly will be comparing ourselves to others. Okay, so I've tried to outline there on paragraph 13, just to give you a flavour of the types of recommendations that can be made back to the force. Just so that you understand the sort of thing that would come out of this. And a lot of these are obviously their learning points. Can I just say that we've just looked at data from Q3 last year, which was from October to the end of December, and 10 recommendations were made back to the force, learning points, and all those recommendations were accepted and agreed and are being acted upon. The force do have the opportunity to reject any of those recommendations and say, thank you very much, but we're not doing anything about that for a reason, but they do have that opportunity. So, but however, that has not been the case, certainly for the third quarter of last year. And can I say, although I've set those out, I know they look brief. I'd have to have the information on each one of those to answer any in-depth questions. I'm afraid it's just giving you a brief outline. I appreciate in that table. Moving on, and this is a discussion we've had in the office about equality monitoring data. Okay. So when the complaint is initially received, the PSD will, and as you know, you look at complaint files, they will record that information. When we receive a review, and we have all our templates and documents in place, but we have not collated equality information. And I have to say that might have been neglectful on our part. I will put my hand up to that. And we've subsequently had a discussion about, well, hang on, shouldn't we be doing this? Having had that discussion, we then sort of got into what benefit and what will we do with it and why would we keep it and all the GDPR requirements. It would be a case of, were we to start collating that information, we would have to ask again. We could not go into the force system and use the original data that was provided because that was done for the purposes of the force, and we would be asking it, and under GDPR we would have to collate it again. But I suppose in our discussions we sort of didn't really come to a conclusion, and I hope the committee don't mind, but I've sort of brought it here to gather your views on that. It's an easy thing for us to collate. Part of it is, I suppose, we did discuss the perception of the member of the public that we really want to focus on their issue and getting it right, and not to give a perception that we're more focused on collecting data. And having already provided it data once from the complainant, it might look like that, I don't know. But is the benefit in looking at what sort of complainants come to review? And is there an issue there? I'm just grateful for any views that the committee may have. And could I just mention one other thing, Chair? I know the Commissioner's on the line now, probably. He may also wish to raise a matter with you concerning how we've undertaken the process in the office. But I'll leave that for the Commissioner as and when you bring him in.
Thank you for that, Angela. Can I just clarify one thing before I come to Lynn, who I can see has put her hand up, and that's to go back to the issue around collecting equality information. Am I right in understanding from what you've just told us that it would be difficult to apply this retrospectively? So in other words,
Yes.
for those things that have come in already, it would be quite a performance to go back and collect this data retrospectively, but prospectively it wouldn't be a particularly difficult thing for you to do.
Absolutely right. We could start to do that almost immediately. To go back and ask would be more problematic. Yeah. And we have if we do this, we have to do that, although that information is already available, but we can't, through GDPR rules and regulations, use someone else's data for our records.
That's really clear. Thanks very much, Angela. Lynn, sorry to keep you waiting.
That's okay. Yes, I was thinking about the quality monitoring, and my view is yes, I think you should be looking at that, partly because of the reasons given at 5 about why the change was made in the first place for the PCC to look at reviews, is that they are impartial, carried out independently, and basically give a greater assurance to the public that there's not any bias on behalf of the police. And one of the things I know you say is that you're looking for themes that might come up, and so far no themes have come up. But one of the things I'd be interested in is what would happen if a theme could be identified around a protected characteristics, for example. And so I do think it would be important I recognise going forward only in this case, but I do think it would be appropriate to be cross-referencing that so that you could see if there were any themes, and that would give a lot of assurance, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I mean, I suppose in terms of putting this question to the committee, Angela, I'd turn the question around in terms of our consideration as to, should information around ethnicity be equality information be collected? Why not? What would be the reasons for not doing? I mean, you've said you want to make sure you don't ask people for information that perhaps isn't directly relevant to what they're asking. But we ask for this information in lots of other circumstances. So can I open this up for some discussion? Why wouldn't we do this? What reason would there be for us not doing this?
Chair, before you open it up to discussion, I wonder if it might be possible for me to make a few comments.
Absolutely.
As I'm the person, I suppose, responsible for how this new system works. Can you hear me all right?
Well, I can. Is everybody else?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, jolly good. Yes, go ahead.
Well, I obviously want to know what your views are on this, but the first thing to say is apologies for not being online with you in a normal way. I've had terrible trouble with my password today, and IT can't fix it in time. So really sorry about that. Secondly, I want to take the opportunity, as this is my last possible meeting of the Ethics Committee, to really warmly thank you all for being members of this really important Ethics and Complaints Committee. It's a really important public service, and I think it's extremely worthwhile both for the police and for the OPCC. So a very warm thank you from me for all the work you've done over the last 5 years. And coming straight to this issue, which is one that has concerned me, I have to say. Because, well, let me just make very few points. Looking at the report that's before you, and thank you, Angela, for that. A short point at 8, paragraph 8. I don't think it was the guy who came over to us retiring that made the difference. It was him leaving that made the difference. And you may tell from my voice that I'm still not happy about the way in which that occurred. The understanding he was there to assist me in making these decisions, and then within a short period of time, he was persuaded to go back to another job. I'm still not happy about that process, I have to say. Put that on one side. Let's deal with the rest of the report. On the issue that's been raised, on principle, I absolutely agree that quality monitoring should take place. I think that should have happened from the start. I think I blame myself slightly for that. I don't think I was aware of the problem enough, but of course it should happen. There's no good reason for it not to, and it might well be useful in my view. There's another problem attached to that, and that's this. There are complainants who are very regular complainants to the police and who are known to the police, not because they've committed terrible offences, but because they're just known to the police for minor matters and all the stuff that the police do that doesn't involve crime. They are, from my brief experience, quite regular complainants. What is absolutely vital in their cases is, of course, that they may be well known as a whole to the police, that their cases are all looked at in exactly and precisely the same way. The mistake can be made for them as it can be for anybody else. And it's their interests too that I think should be protected as well. So I make that. But on the equality monitoring point, definitely, yes. My other point is really this. Two other points. We are told we cannot reinvestigate the complaint. I'm not quite sure what that means, to be honest, because it's very hard sometimes to have to make a decision about whether the original complaint has been dealt with fairly and properly without seeing what the result of that complaint is. And in every case, it will have been dismissed, of course, otherwise it wouldn't get to me. So I think it's too easy to say that the PCC is not able to reinvestigate. He or she has got to have a look and see what were the factors behind the complaint and whether refusing the complaint was justified or not. My third point is one I really need your help on, please, and it's this. I'm a lawyer by training, but I haven't practiced for many years now. I took the view when I was obliged to take this particular task on that it was I and I alone who had to make these decisions. In each case, however minor or complicated, it was my role to do it. I understand that most police and crime commissioners don't take my view, and that this decision-making, the real decision-making, I don't mean the ticking the box, the real decision-making is made either by someone in the OPCC of their office, or in some cases, what happens is it's sent out to a company, often I think made up of ex-police officers, but not always, probably a mixture, who will make up the PCC's mind for them. I put it pretty crudely. And the PCC will obviously have to look and see what they say, but will normally tick it off. I would be very unhappy about that last. I'm prepared for some of the decisions I make now to be made by someone else if it's a really simple case. But on the whole, I think this legislation makes it mandatory for the Police and Crime Commissioner himself or herself to make this decision. And I really may be going over the top about it. Am I wrong about this, or am I right about it? I'm sorry I banged on, but this is perhaps not the major issue that I have to deal with every day, but actually some really important matters of principle arise in this area, I think, and I hope you agree with that. And I'd be grateful for your guidance and your comments, please. Thank you for allowing me to talk to you, particularly over the phone like this.
It's a pleasure. I'm sorry you can't be with us in person or indeed through Microsoft Teams, and I hear the frustration you've had with IT this afternoon. The only thing I can say to you about that is we've all been in that situation, so I'm sure we're all empathising with you. Let's go through this, colleagues, sort of one at a time. The PCC has raised a number of issues, but we started with perhaps the most straightforward of them, but I want to hear what your views are around my question: why shouldn't we collate the equality information? Willie has said basically he would support that. Is there an alternative view around the table? Is there a reason why we would not do that, or would our view as a committee be that although we might not be able to do that retrospectively, that prospectively from this point we would recommend that that information is collected? What are people's perspectives? Shall I read silence as people are happy to take that recommendation? People happy to go in that direction?
Hi Mark, it's Linda here. I think we all kind of had this conversation through the break, and we all came to a consensus that we should absolutely be having the equality monitoring. Obviously, if it starts from now, that's better than not having it at all, from my view. I think we did come to a conclusion collectively that it is a good idea to start collating that information. And why wouldn't you have it, as you say?
Okay, that's really helpful, Linda. Thanks for coming back to me with that. So, if
Mark,
that's a relevant...
on that, Mark,
Yes.
on that, Mark, I would just add that obviously one of the obligations upon any data controller under GDPR legislation is that information is only collected if there's a lawful and legitimate purpose for it. You don't ask for information unless you need it or you have a use for it, and therefore, collecting the data is important, but I think the office needs to be clear as to why it's being collected and what it's going to be used for. And I think that was one of the points that Angela was making. And I think there's a legal obligation to think in those terms as well. So it's not just that it would be useful, it's actually, it serves a purpose. And the OPCC should be clear on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful observation, Stephen, and I think we can make the response to that through collecting this data, we will be then in a better position to evaluate the procedure as a whole in terms of whether it's representing the full range of the community, which we can't do quite as easily without that information. So I think there's a reason that we can give for collecting it that does hold water, but that it's useful to have that. Are there other perspectives? And to improve practice, as I've just seen come across my screen, which I think is a useful addendum. Are there any other perspectives on this first part? Okay, so can we conclude there in relation to the first question about whether, that's been put to us very usefully by Angela, should we prospectively collect this information, that it would be the recommendation of the committee that yes, we should collect that information, and that if we were asked to justify why we were doing that, it would be around improving service and monitoring that the complaints procedure is representing the community as a whole, that we would justify and explain what we're doing. Now, Willie went forward then to raise a couple of additional... Hello, was that you, Stephen? Willie went forward at that point to raise a couple of additional points. The first one is, I think, is perhaps in some ways linked to the second one, around whether it's the PCC's responsibility individually to make the decisions directly, or whether that can be, and excuse me, I'm putting words in your mouth here, Willie, to sort of farm out that responsibility either to the office of the PCC or indeed to a third party company. I can only tell you what I think. I'll be very interested what other people around the table think. It seems a very strange idea that you would farm this decision-making process out to a third party company. And I think if the responsibility rests with the PCC, then there's a clear line of sight to it being the PCC's responsibility directly, and not a third party, whether within the PCC's office or external to the PCC, who should make it. Gail, did I see your hand going up there?
Yes, Mark, it did. I think just in terms of public confidence, and for people to feel that any decisions made in terms of complaints is objective, I think the public will want to know that it's not the police policing themselves.
Yeah.
So I think that there's very much a feeling that there isn't that much difference between the OPC, between the Police and Complaints Commission and the police. That's just the perception I think that a lot of people will have. They won't see that distinction, so they may actually see it as one and the same. Yeah, I think we just need to consider that.
I think that's a useful point. I mean, there is a distinct difference. I mean, first and foremost, the PCC is an elected office who works closely with the police, but is not part of the police. I have some insight.
I mean, I think we understand that because we're very involved in it. But I think the general public, were you to ask, Joe Blogs, Josephine Blogs on the street, they may not have that understanding. So maybe it's about comms, I don't know. But I think, the central point for me is that if somebody makes a complaint against the police, and it's going to be reviewed, they want to have confidence that the person who's doing the reviewing isn't the police themselves or very closely aligned with them.
So can I just push you a little bit and try and tease this out? Are you making an argument here that actually there might be some benefit from a third party agency that was evidently separate from and independent of the police having the sort of...
I think it should be considered as an option. I'm not strict either way. I think it should be considered as an option, or if we think it should be the OPCC, then we just need to be very clear in our communication with the person that's making a complaint that it is a separate organisation. And I just think that you may have some difficulties with some members of the public. That's my personal view.
Yeah, that's what we want, Gail. Thank you for expressing it so directly and straightforwardly. Are there other views around the table? Are there things other people want to say?
Yes, I think it's worthwhile putting this decision in the context of the scheme as a whole. And obviously, the new scheme has replaced the old scheme, and so historically there's always been a distinction between dealing with appeals on the level of importance as to whether it goes to the IOPC or whatever it was historically called, and those appeals which have been dealt with in-house, and the notion is always that the Chief Constable deals with that. Now, whatever, back to the old Police Complaints Board and all of the old processes, there's always been a question mark over the true independence of who reviews the complaints process, and that's still the case to some extent now with the IOPC as well. And one of the observations in complaints, as I think as Lord Bax just alluded to there, is that these organisations are often staffed by ex-police officers because they've got a history of investigation, and they know how to do an investigation, and it's an investigation of the police, and therefore they have the skills to do that. I think it is worth remembering here that the whole aim of the scheme was to deal with exactly the issue that Gail has identified, the perception that, as it used to be called, an appeal, being an appeal to the Chief Constable, is one which was problematic, to say the least. And therefore, obviously, having the the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner as a separate entity is one that suggests a degree, an arm's length degree and more independence. I see your point, Gail, about well, perhaps this third agency might increase that sense of transparency. I'm not sure it does. I think it adds an opacity to it. This isn't what the scheme was designed to be. This isn't what the scheme, how it was designed and why. The reason it goes to the IOPC is, so the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner, the reason it goes there is because the Police and Crime Commissioner is subject to an electoral process and can be held to the ultimate accountability of the public of being kicked out at the next election. Indeed. Whether that's the right way to do policing is an entirely different way, and a lot of interesting questions we could talk about there. My problem with it going to a third-party agency is that unlike the IOPC, who we know what they are a statutory body that is set up under a statutory scheme, subject to a series of regulations, subject to oversight of a number of different government audit bodies and overall processes. In the same way that the PCC is subject to accountability mechanisms either the ballot box or police and crime panels, we've got here, in essence, a private organisation making decisions around the public complaints process that's fundamentally important to the confidence in the police and the confidence in policing in a very opaque way. I had no idea that this was taking place. I'm fascinated by it. And as someone interested in policing, I'm also horrified by the idea. Now, to go back to Lord Back's question as to whether or not he should personally make the decision, I've always assumed, again, not having done it, but as a student of the police in the process, that this is a bit like, a vice-chancellor's responsibility in a university or a head of school's responsibility or a head of college, in that notionally the responsibility is upon them, but we accept that it's usually delegated. So I've always assumed, for instance, that in relation to the chief constable's obligations...
Sorry to interrupt you, Stephen, but whilst a head teacher would notionally have responsibility and somebody might do the work on that person's behalf, it would be the head teacher who would be held accountable subsequent to the decision being made. So there is a slight difference there, isn't there? I'm sorry to be pedantic about it, but it's a question of it's a question of direct line of sight responsibility. And I would just reiterate the point that I made a couple of minutes ago around IOPC isn't locally elected. And you've made that point very articulately, Stephen. I have to say to you, I do think it should be the PCC who makes these decisions directly. He or she might get somebody to do some preparatory work for them in preparing it. But Willie used a very interesting expression when he was talking about, when he raised the question with us, and that was that, somebody else should make up the PCC's mind for him or her. That I don't like at all. It's got, if there's a line of sight responsibility here, it's got to sit, the buck has to stop somewhere. So I suggest needs to stop with a locally elected person.
If I could, but I think actually in terms of electoral processes as well, I think probably a better analogy rather than someone like a head teacher, the better analogy will be a minister.
Okay.
So, for instance, what I'm doing work at the moment on, tangentially, but doing work at the moment on immigration decisions, and technically all the decisions that the Home Office make are signed off as decisions that are made by the Home Secretary. So if you read an appeal against a decision that's made, it's often it's described, I think, almost in fictional terms, that the Home Secretary has personally investigated and made the decision. I think they will sign it off, and therefore there is a line of accountability. But again, Lord Back will know better than me as someone who's been in government. I'm sure there are lots of examples of ministers signing off individual decisions that they have to take accountability for, but in essence, they are massively guided, if not decided for, by their officials and their team. And I would have thought that you could have the same here. The part of the accountability process is Lord Back or whoever the PCC is wants to make sure that they've got a process in place and a team in place that they're happy with the decision making. Whether that means they have to make every decision, they have to sign it off. Whether they have to actually make it, I would suggest probably not. But I think we could probably both agree that a third-party organisation making that decision, I don't see that. I'm horrified by that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the usual precision, Stephen. That's really helpful. Are there any other views around the table that people want to express? And then I'll try and summarise where we've got to.
Can I just come back on Steve's point and his horror at this being a third party process? I think we're assuming that the third party is not going to be very good, basically. And I think if we were going to delegate to a third party, we'd have to have some checks and balances. So unless everybody else overrules me, I don't think it's something that we should just, discount. Because I think I can't think of a good example actually, but there must be other circumstances where these things are delegated to another organisation with obviously some checks and balances just to maintain that objectivity.
Okay,
my concern is not about the quality of decision making. My concern is about the transparency and accountability in what is a public stroke borderline quasi legal process. There are lots of examples of outsourcing of all sorts of different processes in government, local authorities and others. But what we are talking here, particularly is it's around questions of accountability for complaints processes and the fundamental nature of what that means for confidence in the police. I want the organisation that does that to be known to me, to be transparent, and not to be not to have a decision maker delegating this to another organisation and not being clear and open about that. I think that's really problematic.
Okay, I'm going to draw this to some sort of conclusion because we're getting a little short of time. Sorry to do that, colleagues. I think in response to your questions, Willie, it's evident that we can be pretty direct in terms of the first one, which as I thought would be the more straightforward one. But it's really interesting to hear the discussion around the second and third question you have asked us. I think Gail said something that I just thought was fascinating, and that I haven't heard before, but I need to think about this, is that there may be some public confusion about the degree to which the office of the PCC is independent of, separate from, distinct from that of less police, and that in our community there's definitely a comms issue to be dealt with there. In terms of your direct question about should you deal with it, should PCC deal with it, should another person deal with it, it's clear that there isn't a sort of a distinct agreement that we're coming to on a response to that question. It would seem that there is some reservation. Stephen and I have certainly articulated it around a third party. I don't think, Gail, we're making the assumption necessarily that the third party is of poor quality. It's the point that Stephen made around transparency and accountability that is important. Personally, although I don't speak for the committee, I think I'm with you, Willie. If I was PCC, I would hang on to this as a part of my ongoing duty and responsibility. So yes, I would. The buck has to stop with you as from my perspective, as the locally elected PCC, acting separately from, independently of the police. And if the public are not happy with that, well, they have a chance at the ballot box to express that. I'm of course talking about what I think. If there are other views that I haven't, some apologise. Here's a minute or so just to bring them to the table. Otherwise, I'll bring this to a conclusion as we need to move on to the last item on the agenda.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's a really helpful discussion from everyone. I'm really grateful for it. I mean, it's not something that will affect me for long because I'm gone in 6 weeks' time, 7 weeks' time. But I think it is quite an important issue. What I've said about other OPCCs isn't gospel necessarily. I mean, I haven't done any statistics or anything on it. It's as much as what I've heard as what I know. But I am grateful, and I actually think you're right, Chair. Gail's point about public not knowing the distinction or realising the distinction between a police and crime commissioner and individual police force is a very interesting, important point. I mean, I really have tried to be as independent as I possibly can. Obviously, I think all PCCs would be in this regard. This is serious stuff. This is maybe minor, but it actually has some effect on people, and they have bigger principles behind it. And to be absolutely frank, the police have been absolutely first rate with me when I've made my decisions. I mean, I haven't felt that feeling, oh, what's he doing now? Why is he doing this? It's my decision. I have to make it, and it may be helpful, it may not be helpful. But this discussion has been very helpful. Thank you for taking up so much time with it. Grateful to you.
It's a pleasure. I mean, you started, Willie, by being very generous to us as committee members about the value of what we're doing, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of the committee for expressing that so fulsomely. We're very aware that this is your sort of swan song as our PCC, so I wanted to talk about just two things very briefly that I think that are indicative of your time as PCC, that I think are real strengths that you brought to the role. They are, from my perspective. Please, colleagues, come in if you've got other points of view. Firstly, it's been evident, Willie, right from the outset that you have brought a commitment to direct contact with the public to your work as PCC that I think is laudable. And that you've maintained throughout your time as PCC. And it's evident through talking to Angela and hearing some of the things that you're doing, seeing the coverage in the press, that that's been a consistent theme. You've put yourself out a bit to actually go and press the flesh, talk to people, listen to people's concerns. And I think that is, absolutely exemplary, a mechanism of keeping in contact with what people are saying. I also think that you mentioned in Epsom that it's been some time since you practiced as a lawyer, but it's been evident to me in any contact that I've had with you to this point that you certainly bring a lawyer's precision with respect to detail to this job, and you're clearly thinking through the issues, with great precision, with great clarity, which I think has been helpful to us as a committee, but more importantly to the people of Leicester and Leicestershire, and to the force. So, on behalf of the committee, thank you, and we wish you well with whatever the future is. It's going to be an interesting time.
So, thank you very much for those kind comments. I have to be honest, I couldn't hear everything you said, Chair. Because me and technology don't work well together, I'm afraid, and even this phone call is proving a bit difficult now. But thank you very much for what you said, and thank you again for what you're doing, and please keep up the good work.
Thank you. We are very short of time, folks. In fact, we are within the last minute of the time we've got. We have got agenda item 8, which I think Richie we're going to raise. It's the ethical dilemmas. I wanted to give a bit more time than we would ordinarily have to Willie coming in on his last opportunity to talk to us as a committee and to reflect on his time as a perhaps we'll suggest that we hold them over until the next meeting, unless Rich will be guided by you here. There is urgency for us to take the issues forward. What's your view?
I don't think there's any particular urgency. I was going to say we probably touched upon this point in the first paper, just around that kind of ethical decision around how we enforce the COVID lockdown. So I don't think there's particularly any urgency, Chair. So if you wish to sort of put this over to the next meeting, then that's I've not got an issue with that at all.
Okay, Rich, thank you. I think I'm struggling to, just in a message come across my screen that people are struggling to hear. I think in those circumstances and the fact that we're running out of time, I would ask that we hold the ethical dilemmas over to the next meeting. Next meeting is on 18th of June. And I thank everybody around the table for bearing with me, particularly as chair this afternoon. We got through, I think. Well, normal service will be resumed with proper chair next time around. And I wish you all well and to stay safe and healthy. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.